Hello and welcome to Down Home Fear, where we explore true crimes and strange happenings of the American South. My name is Keegan, and this is the 10th full-length episode of the show. Yay!
Hi, Amy here, also, by the way.
Yeah, Amy's back. You may remember her from episode 7 and episode 8. So I'm really, really excited that we've made it to 10 full shows before the end of the year. That was actually like a goal that I had in the back of my mind for this project, and it's just awesome that people are out there downloading them and listening, and
from all over the world.
From countries in Europe that I've never heard of, and like seriously, like looking at the statistics that we get through SoundCloud and in the DHF website, it is always really, really interesting because of that. But today we're going to be talking about cannibalism. We have a historic story, and then we also have a story from the recent past. And for some reason, I was originally envisioning this as like a Christmas episode.
Christmas cannibalism.
Yeah, I think just because of the alliteration.
It's a good call.
I was like, yeah, Christmas cannibalism. It has sort of a ring to it, but I think this is only very tangentially related to Christmas.
It's the timing.
Just, yeah.
Also, mine is winter related.
There you go. So we have kind of a winter tale of sorts.
Exactly, and we were recording on the first day of winter. So.
Oh, really?
Yeah, today's the first day of winter.
I didn't know that.
The more you know.
Yeah, that's great. So let's get to the first topic, and so we'll have a story read by Amy about the colony of Jamestown, and then after that we'll have a second story read by myself that has to do with Fayette County, West Virginia. All right, so let's get started.
Awesome. So, if you grew up on the East Coast, predominantly the Southeast or the Mid-Atlantic, you likely went to Jamestown on a field trip, much like Keegan and I did in elementary school. We trekked through the mud because the geniuses behind the settlement decided a swamp was a great place to live. But I won't go too much into the background of Jamestown itself. Just know that if you like history, the Jamestown settlement is something you may want to pick up a book or watch a documentary about. It's a very interesting foundational piece of our country. Anyway, Jamestown was the first permanent English settlement in the New World. Here's what you need to know. This Virginia settlement was established in 1607 by about 100 English men and boys. The goal of the settlement was to gain resources, like the Spanish had with gold. Things were rough from the beginning. There were illnesses from mosquitoes, they had a fire destroying their provisions, and a severe drought. So all of those issues were faced in the first years at James Fort. So why did we pick this story? You may have an idea. Things in Jamestown started to get grim in the winter of 1609 to 1610, or grimmer than they already were.
Mm-hmm.
More settlers had come since the original 100 in 1607, and they faced a few difficult issues in that winter. The most important being food shortages and a high-stakes siege by Powhatan Indian warriors. So let's break it down. Food shortages were the biggest direct impact on the settlers that winter. The drought I mentioned earlier actually lasted for 7 years.
Oh my gosh.
I know. I read an article that was saying that they settled in the absolute worst period of time because it was right in the middle of this drought.
That's terrible. It's a drought, yet you're in the middle of a swamp, and the water is pretty much unusable.
Yeah, because it's brackish water. And so, like, you have all these mosquitoes, which bring disease that they're not used to. The water can be unusable, and they have a drought, which impacts their food sources. So everyone, including, like, the American Indian tribes that were there, were being impacted by this drought. Speaking of the American Indians, the settlers depended on trade with the Powhatan Confederacy, which were tribes under Chief Powhatan, to gain food, but their relations were strained due to mistrust on both sides and retaliating violence, which if you know anything about this time period, or even seen the Disney movie Pocahontas, you might know. Not an accurate representation, by the way.
But what was accurate was that there was a lot of tension between the settlers and between the Native Americans who were living in that area.
Yes, and a big part of that was this drought. So the resources were already few and far between. Plus, there was mistrust already from previous settlers. So, like, it was kind of a time bomb. From what I read, like, John Smith, who is famous, did a good job for a few years in maintaining trade relations, but kind of screwed it up later, and, like, things just continued to get worse. So, in response to the struggle that they were having with supplies, the Virginia Company sent 9 ships in the summer of 1609 with new colonists and enough supplies to last them through the winter. So with the drought and the struggling relations with their neighbors, these supplies would be crucial to Jamestown's survival. But because apparently no one can escape the cruel wrath of Mother Nature, the ships were severely damaged when they were hit with a hurricane. The largest ship, the Sea Venture, was shipwrecked on Bermuda. It, of course, had most of the supplies. In August 1609, some of the ships that were impacted arrived at Jamestown with a few supplies and 300 more colonists.
Oh, no.
Yeah. Also, just like a cool side note about this, the Sea Venture's shipwreck was what is thought to be the inspiration for The Tempest, Shakespeare's The Tempest. So,
I'm sorry, I don't know what that is.
Okay, recommend you read it or maybe see the play. It's
I'm not
good.
familiar with the classics like you are.
So I thought that was a cool factoid. Anyway, so while the remaining ships brought more supplies, they also brought more mouths to feed, 300 more mouths, and rats, which further cut into their supplies to survive the winter. To add to this, Chief Powhatan also issued an order to his warriors to kill the colonist livestock and any colonists outside of the safety of the fort walls. So I'm sure you're asking, where is the true crime portion of this? Why did we decide to go so far back in history? Keegan, what do you do when you run out of food, are cut off from trading to obtain food, and are essentially trapped in place with other people?
Well, I would imagine that it possibly may cross your mind to consume other people.
Yes. So what I was going to say is you begin to eat things you normally wouldn't, or you starve.
Okay, I just went directly to that.
Knowing
the theme
steps.
of the episode.
Fair enough.
I was biased. I was okay. But yeah, so they had no supplies, and they were probably reduced to eating the leather shoes or equipment that they brought with them.
Good call. So there were 500 people. And just for your reference, this winter is called the Starving Times. So just to give you a hint of where we're going. A man named George Percy became a leader of the fort when the famous John Smith, who I also just want everybody to know, if I was going to do a podcast about like crazy, ridiculous people, he would be at the top of my list. This guy is nuts.
Really?
Yeah, he's got a really cool backstory, which I won't go into here.
And just to establish, because you kind of alluded to it earlier, but John Smith was the first kind of like major leader that rose up.
He was, I think, the second leader because he came in and improved things.
Okay.
But yeah, he was a leader in the group. He did work with the Powhatan Confederacy to help with the trading, but he's kind of strong-armed them a little bit, and he's like a big character. So he's got big stories behind him, and part of this was he actually returned to England in that fall due to a mysterious gunpowder injury.
In 1609?
Yeah, so he left the fall right before, quote-unquote, the starving time. Okay. So lucky him.
Yeah, good time to get out of there.
With a mysterious gunpowder injury.
Right.
So the account I'm about to give is from a letter written by the new leader, George Percy, 16 years after the fact. I translated it from old-timey English just so it's a little bit easier for me to read right now, because how many extra consonants can a word have?
Right.
But maybe I can post the original letter to the Facebook group just in case people
100%. We can put that on the website and on the Facebook group so people can find the full original document there.
Old-timey. So he said, in so many words, having fed upon our horses and other beasts as long as they lasted, we were glad to make shift with vermin as dogs, cats, rats, and mice, as to eat boots, shoes, or any other leather. So you actually did a really good job calling the boots and the leather.
Yeah. Well, it's only because I've heard that before with like stories in World War II in Stalingrad and stuff like that. I mean, it was like not really similar, but they were extreme survival situations where cannibalism and eating rats, eating vermin, eating your shoes, those were all just examples of the many horrors that people had to resort to.
Yeah. So in addition to resorting to eating these things, the colonists started getting diseases like dysentery, which was made life within the walls even worse. Percy also wrote, quote, Indians killed as fast without the fort as famine and pestilence did within. So we talked a little bit about the disease, and they're starving, so they're starting to move down the line. But the Indian part is that apparently, and this is from more of his letters, when colonists went out in search of food past the safety of the walls, they looked for food such as snakes and roots, because that's how desperate they were getting. But they were also killed due to that command from the Chief Powhatan by these warriors. So the siege basically rendered them incapable of getting any external food, and also rendered them incapable of getting any external help from other colonies or anybody else in the area. So these colonists turned from the regular sources of food, like livestock, to going out to finding food. When it became clear that scavenging outside the fort was not an option, they started eating, quote, vermin, which they included dogs and cats as vermin, which totally broke my heart, because...
It was different back then.
I know. So that was not enough for the group of 500 to make it through the winter. Percy continues in this letter and says, and now famine began to look ghastly and pale in every face, that nothing was spared to maintain life and do those things which seemed incredible, as to dig up dead corpses out of the grave and to eat them. And some have licked upon the blood which had fallen from their weak fellows. So yes, you heard that right. The people who helped build the very foundation of America as we know it now only did so because they became cannibals.
Wait, what do you mean by that?
What do you mean by what?
You mean like cannibalism helped sustain them, and otherwise they would have died out?
Yeah, they would have completely, like, they would not have made it through the winter if they weren't digging up dead people, or I guess licking the blood of their weak fellows.
Yeah.
So other accounts outside of Percy's also detail the spiral from livestock to eating their fallen comrades after the sources were used up. But it wasn't just digging up already dead people that was a source of food for them. In another account that was written by some of the survivors, they tell a story about how a man killed his wife while she slept. He cut her into pieces. He salted her, like how you salt meat to keep it. It's like a common way of doing it because they didn't have a refrigerator.
To preserve it.
Yeah. So he salted her and then ate her except for her head. And then he was, quote, apparently, like, he was, quote, justly executed in response for that crime.
Okay.
So I thought that was, like, a really interesting story because it's way more violent. And when I think of cannibalism, that is what comes to mind. It's like a intent to kill to then eat, whereas the other accounts, it really seemed like desperation because they were eating people who had already died. So some of the accounts talked about them eating people who had died because they were killed by Indians. I'm not sure if they had the opportunity to avoid eating people who died from sickness, because one would imagine that would continue, like, you don't eat people who are sick because you would get sick. But I didn't see anything about that. So that was it. Like, this story about the murder jumped out at me and really creeped me out.
I wonder if they ate him after he was executed.
I think that he was burned.
Really?
Yeah. So, like, I didn't write down the source for this, but when I was researching, they talked about him being hung by his. If this is the same person, him being hung by his thumbs and then burned. So, I'm not.
Well, that's gnarly.
Yeah. So while there was evidence of butchered animal bones in Jamestown to support, the fact that they were killing their animals, and it points to this severe hunger. There was no evidence of cannibalism specifically outside of the written accounts until relatively recently. So in 2012, Jamestown archaeologists uncovered the first forensic evidence of survival cannibalism in a European colony in North America. So survival cannibalism, I think that's like the key distinction here is obviously these weren't just serial killers who were out to eat. Like, this is survival cannibalism to the point where, they were doing this because they had to. So I thought that was like a good point to make. So the evidence that they found were bones. They were a butchered skull and the shin bone of a 14-year-old English girl who researchers named Jane. So if you look this up, you'll find Jane. Jane's diet reflected a grain diet, which indicated she was only recently over from England before she died, and her teeth indicate that she was either well-off or the maid of a well-off family, just so you have some background on that. Douglas Olsley, who was a Smithsonian forensic anthropologist who worked on this, because it was, I think, Preserve Virginia, Colonial Williamsburg, and the Smithsonian who worked specifically on Jane. So Olsley says that the cut marks on these bones reveal cannibalism. He said that there was a clear intent to remove the facial tissue and the brain for consumption. He says these people were in dire circumstances, so any flesh that was available would have been used. So just like you said, like, the brain was removed. The tongue was also removed, which was apparently, the tongue was common in recipes back then. I know it's not something we eat very frequently here in the U.S.
Apparently in a lot of Asian cultures, and even like in American, it's a good organ meat. Yeah. It's like a lot of people do continue to eat it as an organ meat. It's supposed to be very nutritious.
Not something I've ever eaten.
Me neither, but apparently some people do. And so is this the photo that I feel like I saw a photo on CNN or something, and it was in regard to this, and it's like a human skull, and there is literally like a 2-inch.
It's a big gash thing. Yeah,
in the forehead.
I can link to there's a 3D reproduction of what she would look like from that, and we can also show what the actual bones look like. Like, we can link to that because I thought that was forensically nerdy. I thought it was very interesting. So Olsley, this forensic anthropologist, also stated that the person who removed her flesh didn't know how to butcher an animal just based off of how it was doing. He said you can see, quote, the hesitancy, trial, tentativeness, and total lack of experience. So again, this points to that survivalism where they were just doing this because they had to potentially, or it doesn't appear that she was murdered. Nothing in this points to her being murdered.
So all the injuries and stuff were post-mortem?
Yes, because that points to that whole lack of experience. So
that's
we
weird.
Don't know how.
So maybe she just had a heart attack or something.
It could have been, yeah. There are so many ways somebody could have passed away during this winter. And it's clear that they just took what they could from her to survive. And I think that he specifically says like hesitancy, and again that points to this was all about survival. Like they had to do this to keep going. They didn't necessarily want to, and it ties back into that like very few people are okay with cannibalism for a specific reason. It's really hard to bring that.
Yeah, it was an absolute last resort.
Exactly. So moving on towards the spring, our old friend, the Sea Venture, arrived in Jamestown. That's right. Those who didn't die or disappear in the wreck in Bermuda helped rebuild and made their way to Jamestown.
That is insane.
It's crazy.
That is so cool.
So there they found only 60 colonists who were left alive. So 500 to 60.
What?
Yeah.
That's crazy.
I'm not entirely sure on the first number. I am entirely
so,
sure.
Wait, so you know I'm not good at math, but that's like over 75%
yeah, no,
of people died, right?
Way too many people. Yeah, no, you're spot on. Like,
way over 75%.
There were different numbers for how many people were there at the beginning, but the 60 was like the final number at the end of this.
So from 500 down to 60.
Yeah.
That is a crazy rate of mortality.
Yeah, it's absurd. So a leader from the Sea Venture, Thomas Gate, who's a name you may recognize if you're into American history, he realized that there was going to be further starvation if they stayed. So he took everybody and he was like, all right, guys, let's go back to England and abandon Jamestown.
Might as well at that point. Do you really want to stay?
Seriously. So he was like, all right, let's go. And I guess on their way out, the new governor of Jamestown, who was sent over from England, like blocked their escape essentially and was like, come on, we gotta go rebuild. So they all went back in the summer of, this all happened in like the late spring, early summer of 1610.
Mm-hmm.
So Jamestown went on to be an important stepping stone in the U.S. becoming the nation that we are today. But I'm not going to go into all that history stuff. My question to wrap this up is, with Jamestown's survival cannibalism, where do you place this on the spectrum of true crime? Outside of the murder with intent to eat, these incidences of maybe digging up corpses, desecration of a body, is it a crime? Or
given the circumstances,
yeah. Or could this be excused based on the fact that it was pure survival? So something to think about.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe also consider, outside of the historical context, like today, if there is some sort of extreme circumstance,
how would we deal with that?
How that resulted in acts of cannibalism for survival, how would we deal with it? And maybe...
Would they write a book like these people did?
Yeah, I mean, what would happen? And I guess maybe if the story of Jamestown isn't true crime, I mean, there was the incident of the man murdering his wife. That's true crime. Outside of that, perhaps it's more true horror.
True horror, like the dark underbelly of the roots of America.
Exactly.
The roots of the American South.
Absolutely, yeah. So, well, thanks for walking us through it and helping us kind of digest some of this.
Oh.
No, I'm not even doing this intentionally. That was so bad. Helping us...
I think you should keep it.
Okay. Helping us make sense of these events.
Great.
For the second story, we're going to be talking about the Mad Butcher of Fayette County. This is a what I've come to realize is a very obscure story from West Virginia. It takes place.
I've never heard of it. So.
Most people haven't. And it takes place in the 1960s in Fayette County, West Virginia. It's in the southern part of the state. It's right up in the Blue Ridge Mountains, very beautiful and picturesque and all of that, but it's also very rural. In the 1960s, it had a population of about 61,000 people, and that's spread throughout the entire 668 square mile area. So it's a pretty small community when you look at it through that lens. And that population, 61,000, was actually its historic high. So it's gone down since then. Maybe this story had something to do with that. Who knows? Anyhow, between 1962 to 1965, at least 3 men were slaughtered by an attacker who has never been officially caught. And that attacker had been dubbed over the years the Mad Butcher. The first believed victim of the Mad Butcher was Ernest Gwynn, and he disappeared on July 3rd, 1962, after leaving a local diner called 4 Minute Lunch. It was in a town called Oak Hill, which is in Fayette County. He was sitting there one night, he had a meal, and he left and was never seen again. Police did not take his disappearance seriously because he was a single male who was in his late 60s and who lived at a boarding house and just happened to have recently cashed a pension check. So I can actually understand that. You know, the authorities hear about this, and, you know, he's an old guy. He moved on. He moved to a different town.
Yeah, I guess, like, 1960s, different time, too.
Yeah, it's not like he's gonna, like, post on Facebook or something and be like, hey, I'm moving out of state. Don't worry about me, you know. But about 3 months later, another man, 33-year-old Sammy Smith, disappeared one night while walking home, also from the 4 Minute Lunch diner. Police, again, did not take the disappearance seriously, maybe because, you know, these are grown men. It's the 1960s, and communication just wasn't the same as it was now. You know, I bet in that area with the nature of the industry there, you know, it was a lot of coal mining and things like that. They probably had people coming and leaving all the time.
Was this gentleman also single?
I believe so.
Okay.
I don't know for sure if he was single, but I do know he was living with his parents at the time. So I would assume he was a single male.
That's interesting, because I could just off the bat assumed he would also be single and also be, like, living alone like the other man.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know if the parents kicked up a fuss, or?
I don't. There's not a whole lot of information out there about this story, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But what I do know is that just 3 months after the disappearance of Ernest Gwynn, Sammy Smith also disappeared while coming home from the 4 Minute Lunch in Oak Hill, West Virginia. But later that year, someone of note went missing. Someone who, and I don't mean to be disrespectful to Ernest Gwynn or Sammy Smith, but I mean, this was someone who wasn't just like a random guy who seemed to have moved away. It was a kid who, you know, just a 19-year-old kid who was pretty well known in the community, and people took notice when he just kind of vanished one day. His name was Mike Rogers, and he was, like I said, a 19-year-old young man, and he was a ward of the state. So he was living with a foster family. He had some sort of mental disability. So he was well known. He was known to be like a really kind of upbeat, enthusiastic guy, really friendly. Everyone seemed to like him. And he was often described as a quote-unquote lovable character. On December 19th, 1962, Rogers was seen riding in the passenger seat of a black station wagon with Ohio license plates. And I am getting this information from an article that is kind of confusingly written, so this next part was a little unclear to me, but either a friend noticed Rogers walking on the side of the road after getting out of the vehicle, or he saw Rogers in the vehicle and Rogers like jumped out of the vehicle and darted over to the friends who was driving on the other side of the road.
Okay.
So in any case, there's this friend of Rogers's.
Sees him associated with the car, and the guy gets out.
I think so. That's the way I read it. But again, like it's a little unclear. There's not a whole lot of information out there about this. So in any case, Rogers runs up to his friend's car and like forcibly just rips open the door and is like, hey, like you gotta get me out of here, and he's like really, really he said angry, like the guy in the car said that he seemed angry and that it kind of like seemed really unlike him. Usually he's so calm and upbeat and everything, but he actually just told him, like, hey man, chill out, I'm running errands right now, I'll come back in a half hour and pick you up. Rogers was never seen again.
Oh no!
Yeah.
I would feel really bad if I was that guy.
I'm sure that dude just hated himself after what ended up happening, which was 8 days later, a young boy discovered a human arm on the hillside of Chimney Corner, which is an unincorporated community in the northern part of Fayette County.
That's scarring for life.
Yeah, and on that note, this next section actually does get pretty graphic, so if you're sensitive to descriptions of gore, you may want to skip over this part. Cops are called and they arrive and they do a search of the area and they find a trail of body parts scattered across the hill that the human arm was found on. At the bottom of the hill, they find a U.S. Navy duffel bag full of human organs,
No.
price tags from a store in Ohio, and Mike Rogers' severed head.
No.
Yeah.
Oh no.
Yeah. There was also a .22 caliber bullet that was found in the duffel bag.
Like a fired bullet or an unfired? It didn't say.
It said that it was a damaged bullet, so I don't know if that means that it was unfired and there was like a defect that prevented it from being used, or if it had been fired and was like deformed after being shot.
Yeah. Wait, can we talk about the price tags for a second? Because
Sure.
that's a very strange. Like, are you talking about price tags like off of clothing or like stick-on price tag?
Yeah, just like a price tag you would see on a article of clothing or a
And there were
like
just
object in a store.
a collection of them in this bag with the organs.
I don't know if it was a collection per se, but it was multiple price tags from a store that was located in the state of Ohio.
That is so strange. That's so strange.
Yeah, I guess it's really all they had to go off of, though. And Mike Rogers had been killed execution style, and then he had apparently been hung by the neck while being dismembered. They found a basically like rope marks around his neck, so it suggested he had been hung by his neck.
But they're thinking it's post-mortem.
But yeah, post-mortem. And he was hung by his neck while being butchered. His body was in 13 pieces. The coroner stated that the liver and kidney, two of the organs that were found in the duffel bag, had a chewed appearance to them, suggesting that the killer had attempted to eat the organs raw.
Ew.
Yeah. Eventually, the cops contacted the Navy about the bag, and I guess it had like a man's name stitched on it or something like that, and the Navy tracked it to a guy who was living in Michigan. That man said that he had lost the bag on a Greyhound bus somewhere between Michigan and South Carolina in 1959. He said he remembered stopping in West Virginia during that trip, but wasn't sure if he had lost the duffel bag there. This part is also uncomfortable, so just, you've been warned. But so, due to unusual incisions on Rogers's penis, the cops rounded up 10 gay men who had been, I know, yeah, it's pretty horrible. They rounded up 10 gay men in the community who had been suspected of sodomy, so it's just like, come on. Pretty
1960s.
Yeah,
That's ridiculous.
Yeah, terrible that those men were just stereotyped like that. One of these men who they had randomly rounded up on, I guess, suspicion of being gay was a man named Estill Snier. And he did turn out to be a somewhat convincing lead. When the cops searched his car, he had a bloody axe, a butcher knife, and a hacksaw.
Yeah, those would be clues.
Right. But he not only had those items, he also had been employed at a Greyhound bus stop in 1959, which is when the duffel bag went missing. Snier insisted that he had been out of the state at the time of the murder of Mike Rogers, and he also insisted that the tools were used for freelance butchering work, which I kind of believe.
Yeah, I was also wondering because
I mean, this is rural West Virginia.
Yeah, so I was wondering about hunting because the way you were again, this is gruesome and horrible, but the way you were talking about how Mike Rogers had been hung up like that, that's how they butcher pigs?
Well, usually you would hang him by their speaking in terms of butchering an animal.
Yes.
Like you hang them by their legs, and the head would actually be hanging down.
Okay. I did not know that. I know very little about butchering.
Yeah, I mean, I've never personally butchered an animal, but I watch a lot of hunting shows, so that's how they do it.
Okay. Coming at you with the knowledge.
Right, and so anyway, rural West Virginia, I believe it would have been around deer hunting or maybe bear hunting season at that point in time. Remember, this happened in late autumn, in December, when Mike Rogers' body was found. And so, yeah, I think that there's probably a lot of guys who would have had similar equipment in the backs of their truck for hunting and other legitimate purposes. But after he was questioned by the police, there was a bunch of just kind of he said, she said bullshit. Like, someone claimed that Snier had actually molested him at gunpoint, and that
he's got crazy real fast.
Yeah, I know. And there was also suspicious rope that was found in Snier's car, but he was never formally charged. A couple of weeks later, Snier turned himself into Fayette County Jail, saying that he didn't want to hurt anyone, and he just needed to be incarcerated, I guess, for the public's best interest or something. But he didn't say that I don't want to hurt anyone else or I don't want to kill again or something like that. He just said that he didn't want to hurt anyone. So he was voluntarily entered in the Fayette County Jail, but he was never formally charged, and he committed suicide shortly thereafter, and the case remained open. About 6 months later, in 1963, Ernest Gwynn's skull, presumably, they found a skull that had similar dental work to Ernest Gwynn. They found it by some railroad tracks in Thurman, West Virginia, and that was the only evidence they found suggesting that Ernest Gwynn had been killed, because he just disappeared. They never found body parts or anything. They just, eventually found that skull with the matching dental work. Toward the end of that year, 1963, a man named Shirley Jean Arthur went missing. So it was a male. His name was Shirley. I know that can be confusing. He had been at his girlfriend's house practicing for an upcoming gospel concert, which is just a really weird random fact that they have in the article that I read. But yeah, he was with his girlfriend practicing for an upcoming gospel concert and shared a yellow apple with her before walking home around 1 a.m.
That's very specific details in the article.
Well, just wait, because
okay.
Shirley was last seen hitchhiking to a nearby town later that night, trying to get back from his girlfriend's place. Now, fast forward a few days, a young boy, Leonard Sizemore, who was in his teens, he wasn't really that young, he was a teenager, and he was with his brother and a couple of friends, and lo and behold, he saw a dead pig, what he thought was a dead pig, on a hillside in Wyoming County, which is near Fayette County. It's just south of Fayette County, actually. He and his friends went to examine it because they were like, oh, hey, a dead pig. Let's go check that out. Again, West Virginia, the 60s. And unfortunately, they realized that it was actually Shirley Arthur's torso wrapped in tarp and secured with mining explosive wire.
Like, was it connected to an explosive?
No, like it was just like used to wrap up the tarp around the body, and it was just his torso, so it was missing the head and arms and legs and everything. Sizemore later described the incident as upsetting at the time.
Yeah, I could understand that completely. I feel like
I'm
even
with you,
just
Leonard.
listening to this is upsetting. I can't imagine being like a child and
Oh man,
coming across this.
yeah, it would be absolutely horrifying. You know, that was actually like one of my biggest fears when I was a kid was finding like a butchered torso in the woods.
I feel like you watched too much Law and Order as a kid.
No, it was Forensic Files. There was this episode of Forensic Files that I saw when I was like way too young to be watching Forensic Files, and it was like a similar situation. There was like a woman's like torso found in a trash. Anyway, it was like
terrible.
Terrible. An autopsy revealed that the body had yellow apple in its stomach, and that's how they knew that it must have been Shirley Arthur. But a autopsy also revealed that the kidney was missing. So remember, the kidney was one of the organs that had been taken and chewed, attempted to have been consumed from the Mike Rogers, who had been abducted and killed about a year earlier. His heart had 19 puncture wounds in it, similar to buckshot, but no buckshot was found lodged in the body, which you would expect because buckshot is like really tiny little BBs, basically. So I was thinking maybe with like an ice pick or something that could have left similar wounds.
I guess.
I'm not a coroner, so but that's just one thing that came to mind. Around this time, other people went missing in Fayette County as well, but they were officially disconnected from the Mad Butcher murder. One of them was a man named Lou Bennett, who was last seen having a meal at the 4-Minute Lunch.
This place is bad.
Yeah, in 1963, at the 4-Minute Lunch, Lou Bennett was last seen there, and his remains ended up being found 2 years later near some railroad tracks, and had been blown to pieces by dynamite in what was officially ruled a suicide.
What?
Lou Bennett was an uncle of my maternal grandmother.
Huh.
She remembered him very fondly, said that he was, her favorite uncle, and that everyone really liked him. Yeah, so my grandma just sent me an email about this yesterday when I told her that this was the story I was working on. She says that everyone thought it was complete bullshit, that it was a suicide.
Yeah, suicide by dynamite is...
It's pretty crazy.
Yeah, like unbelievable crazy.
Yeah, it was... so that's another death that may have been connected to the Mad Butcher case. Also, just another side note, my grandma also said that she thinks that the owner of the 4-Minute Lunch was actually behind these killings.
Oh, is this her conspiracy theory?
I don't know if it's like a conspiracy theory, but apparently she just thought the guy was sketchy.
Oh, she had been to the 4-Minute Lunch.
She like grew, yeah, like so on my mom's side of the family, both of my grandparents are from like that area of West Virginia, like born and raised, and they've moved many times over the years, but like they're
they knew the 4-Minute
Lunch. They knew like a ton of people down there, and they live back in that area today. So yeah, so that's her theory. And or maybe not the butcher himself, but at least like connected somehow, because all these people keep going to this diner and disappearing.
It's weird. Like that makes no sense unless it was a hub for people who were constantly passing through, and it was like well known that you could just grab someone. But
I guess, yeah.
To me, that sounds incredibly sketchy. I'm trusting your grandma on that.
Yeah. So in 1964, the years are going on at this point. It's now 2 years after the initial disappearances. More suspects come up, and the case sort of gains a little bit more attention, and so there's different conspiracy theories about who's involved, kind of running amok. But the most compelling suspect in the eyes of the police came in November of 1964. It was a guy named Hugh Montgomery, and he was arrested for destruction of property at a local hospital after charging into the reception area and demanding to be hired as a doctor. And then when the people who worked at the hospital were like, dude, get out of here, he returned with a sledgehammer and began just like smashing stuff.
That's scary.
Yeah, and he was arrested, and police found 3 guns, a knife, a duffel bag, and a meat grinder in his car and in his house.
Okay. Was he a doctor? Actually, or just...
So, well, he's clearly very mentally ill, but he did go to medical school for 1 year, and he had worked as a physician in the Air Force at one point.
Huh, okay.
Yeah, so that's something to think about. Now, the police questioned him, and he admitted to having committed several murders, but stressed that he was not the Mad Butcher. He said that actually a group of executioners were after him, and he killed them in self-defense and chopped up the bodies so they would, quote, stay dead. He also said that he ground up the human kidneys and sold them to local butchers as proper meat, and that many locals had likely consumed the human organ meat that had been sold in stores in the Fayette County area.
Oh my god. That's so disgusting. Oh my god. Oh,
yeah.
That's horrific. That's like...
It's pretty gnarly.
Real life Sweeney Todd.
Yeah, right?
Oh my god. That makes me sick to my stomach.
I'm sorry.
Ew. Also, side note, this is kind of like when I was looking up examples of modern cannibalism, I read the story about a guy who had a dinner party and served spaghetti with meatballs, and the meatballs were made out of his own fat.
What?
That was removed from liposuction.
That's disgusting.
Yeah.
Oh my god.
I know. Ugh.
Okay. Do you think that's more or less disgusting than kidneys being sold to butchers?
I guess less disgusting because, like...
People know where it came from?
I guess, and like he didn't... Nobody died in the process. Oh, nobody died in the process of obtaining the meatballs, whereas the guy murdered people to get the kidney meat. Like... neither are a good option for me. It's so disgusting.
Do you know when and where that happened? If people were trying to find it, find the story.
In the 2000s, I'll see if I can find it because I was looking for modern examples of cannibalism, and like that's kind of on the line for me. Like, is it cannibalism because it's fat from
No, it's definitely cannibalism.
It is because I normally think of cannibalism as being like the person had to have, passed away. Like it, right?
No.
Okay.
Have you watched the TV show Hannibal?
I think I watched the first episode and then I got creeped out.
It's a very creepy show, but there's some pretty choice scenes of Hannibal portrayed by Mads Mikkelsen, I think is his name. Anyway, he consuming people while they're still alive.
No! Oh, that is so gross.
So according to this TV show, it's possible.
Okay. Well, I'm disgusted either way.
Right.
Back on track.
So he made these claims. He said that the human organ meat had been sold to stores in the area. The Air Force ended up confirming that because he was a physician in the Air Force at the period of time that Mike Rogers went missing, and they said that he had been on duty in Ohio at the time of Mike Rogers' death.
Weird, though, with the Ohio price tags.
Yeah, and the other thing is, and this is, I had to make a couple of assumptions when researching this, so this may not be accurate, but like the only major Air Force base in Ohio is located in Dayton, Ohio, which is about a 4-hour drive from Fayette County. So,
But what? Okay.
so it would be like 4 hours is not a long drive. It would be pretty easy.
Yeah, but like what? Would you just pop into your head one day, like, I'm going to drive to this random county in West Virginia?
Well, he had family there. He was from okay, here's another point.
That is important.
He was from a once prominent, once wealthy local family.
Okay.
That was well known in Fayette County.
This makes so much more sense. Okay.
Yeah, so like maybe he just knew the area better and those were like his old stomping grounds or whatever. But so who knows if he was actually on duty that night. He was described at the time of his arrest as a drifter who had grown delusional after being scorned by a lover.
Okay.
Montgomery was sent to a psychiatric facility shortly after his arrest, and doctors evaluated him and said he was paranoid and homicidal with homosexual tendencies.
Okay.
Right, yeah. So that's their diagnosis. I mean, at the time,
Were they just trying to connect it with the fact that the victims were all men? Or...
I don't know. I mean, it wasn't until the late 60s or early 70s that homosexuality stopped being classified as a mental illness.
That's so ridiculous.
Yeah, which is really sad and fucked up, but like...
Concise.
I mean, I'm not to like mince words or anything, but so yeah, paranoid and homicidal with homosexual tendencies. And he, again, was never formally charged for the murders, and he was ultimately transferred to a facility in Ohio by his family without the consent of the police. So over the years, Montgomery was bounced around between different states and different mental hospitals. The book I read noted that 5 additional torso murders have occurred within a few miles of Montgomery's known locations over the years.
Are you kidding me?
In West Virginia, Texas, and Oklahoma.
Is he still alive?
It is thought that he died in the early 2000s.
What do you mean? What do you mean thought?
Like, they don't know. Like, I mean, he's basically off the grid. Except for when he's in mental institutions.
Oh, so you're saying he was released?
Yeah, like he wasn't. It wasn't like a prison or like a secure psychiatric treatment center.
Oh no.
Yeah, so he was kind of just like bouncing around, living on the lam, I guess.
That is horrific.
Yeah, so an example of this is he was first released from the hospital in Dayton, Ohio in August of 1966, and shortly after, police discovered a dismembered body 25 miles away from the hospital. And similar patterns have occurred throughout his travels across the South.
Are you kidding me?
Yeah.
That's ridiculous. That's ridiculous.
I agree with you.
And he was never arrested?
Never arrested, never caught, never sentenced for murder or even assault or anything like that, as far as I know. He is suspected that he died in the early 2000s. So there was like one person, the last name was Bragg, and they apparently did a whole book on this case, and it was released in the early 90s. And the author of that book, in a more recent interview, said that he's pretty sure that Hugh Montgomery died about like 12 years ago. So
that's a crazy story.
Yeah, and that book that I got the information for this story from is called Myths of the Mountains, the Folk Tales, the Ghost Stories, and the Urban Legends from the Hills of West Virginia. So if you want to page through that, give it a look. It's a really, really easy read. The book is like 80 pages long and just has short articles about various local stories from West Virginia. My grandma sent it to me.
That's nice. That's very sweet.
Yeah, so that's where I got this story from. So I have a question for you.
Hit me.
Do you agree that Hugh Montgomery was behind the murders, or do you think it was someone else?
I think that based on the facts that we have been given in the past, like, half hour, it seems like he would kind of be the choice guy for the job just based on the fact that all of these bodies followed his wake. That's ridiculous.
But I mean, some of it is like a lot of it is like major metropolitan areas too.
Yeah.
Like Dayton, Ohio is a pretty big metropolitan area.
But like dismembered like.
Yeah, I don't know what like the average rate of dismembered bodies to be found in Dayton, Ohio is.
That's probably a good statistic to not know off the top of your head.
Yeah.
But just based off of that information that we have available, to me it seems like he probably did it. Maybe there was some involvement from somebody who knew the 4-minute lunch place really well.
Yeah.
Because it seems really sketchy to me that all these people are getting picked off near there. So something weird is with that. I agree with your grandma.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, he makes sense for what we have available for us now with information.
Right. Also, there's a real dearth of information out there about this case. And the information that I could find was, like I mentioned during the story, I mean, there's little sections in these articles that are just, like, not well written. Like, they're difficult to, like, figure out what the author was trying to explain.
Or oddly specific.
Yeah, or oddly specific about gospel practices and shit. Yeah, so... I guess that's it for this story. So, thanks.
Yeah, no, that was incredibly interesting, but very disturbing.
Yeah,
so.
Absolutely. I apologize if anyone was upset by some of those descriptions. I know they were a little rough.
I was upset by the sausage. That specifically freaked me out.
I'm sorry.
It's okay.
All right. So, Amy.
Yes.
Why do you think cannibalism is so disturbing to us?
So I think part of that has to do with our natural survival instinct. We want to survive, and the confronting the idea of death in such a visceral way is disturbing for anyone. I also think it has something to do with us thinking of our physical form as being connected with that survival, like you're alive, physical form, imagining a dead body and that physical form being consumed is very disturbing to me. I can say that about me, but I'm sure a lot of other
I'd say
people.
most people would think that's disturbing.
Because that is like true death. Especially there might be some religious reasons. I know there's some religious groups that believe your body must remain intact. Like there are people who will not be cremated. Mm-hmm. So like that's an extra layer for people who hold those beliefs, where it's just extra disturbing. And I also, like, if you look at another person, you have empathy for that person. Like the idea of not only like them being dead, but also like murdering them and eating them is just incredible. Like you can't even think that way. Like I cannot bring myself to think about ever doing something like that.
Right. I mean, it's a mutilation.
Exactly.
It's inherently an act of mutilation, in some way.
Yeah, and think about human beings. Like there are human beings who choose to be vegetarian because they're upset about killing animals.
Mm-hmm.
So take that a step further into the human zone. Like we make a choice. There are some people who make the choice not to eat animals. Like human nature is not meant to eat other humans. Like we're just not meant to do that.
Right.
At least that's my interpretation.
Yeah.
I know maybe there are some groups that believe otherwise, but
I'm sure there's all sorts of not just social causes, but evolutionary causes as well. Like there's some like in most cultures in the world, it's not normal or approved of to eat other humans.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So there's probably like some sort of like deep biological instinct for like the preservation of our species and everything, not to resort to acts of cannibalism.
And there's also potentially a disease-driven reason, like if someone passes away, it's not safe. Like even if you think about like an animal that you might eat, like a cow. If a cow passes away and you eat the cow, like decide to eat the cow 2 days after it passes away of natural causes, like what was wrong with that cow? So you can translate to that to a human as well. Like if you, depending on the situation where you are eating a person. So there's so many levels of why this is wrong to so many people.
Right.
Obviously there's some groups of people who believe that consuming a person passes their soul along, like that tribe in South America that believes that. So that like that's a religious reason. So there's some groups that might believe it's okay, but I'm willing to say right now that most human beings believe it is wrong for the myriad of like any of the reasons that we have just listed out.
Right. Okay. So there's just a myriad of different.
Yeah, and like an inherent wrongness to it. Like it makes me sick to my stomach to think about it.
Right. Cool.
Cool.
I think.
Is it cool?
This has been the 10th episode. I plan on coming back with at least 10 more. Whoa.
Hashtag 2017 goals.
Yeah, exactly, man. It's been so awesome just seeing that there's been listener response from his stuff. If it was just like my parents listening to this show, I would not have done it for 10 episodes. But each of these is getting, dozens of downloads, dozens of listens and stuff, which is great.
More than dozens.
Yeah. I mean, like, it's been so awesome. And I honestly, like, wasn't really expecting the show to, like, really be getting those numbers within just a couple of months of debuting. So it's so great. For the upcoming episodes, I'm just going to throw it out there now that there's about a 75% chance that we're going to have a multi-part episode on Casey Anthony coming up.
I feel like I will be a very interested listener in how you approach that.
Right. I am a little intimidated by that story because there's so much controversy surrounding it and so much information and misinformation out there about it. But I just ordered this book off Amazon. I'm going to read this book, and if it maintains my interest, I will come back to you all with a story about it, because for that story, it was such a huge deal, and I tried to follow it on the news and stuff when, like, as the events were unfolding in, like, the late 2000s, early 2010s. But I just, there's so much missing there, and I would really like to know more, so it could be a nice learning experience.
Yeah. I also, as a guest star occasionally and a frequent listener, if you guys have any ideas for future stories for Keegan, definitely send them in or post them on Facebook. It's interesting to hear what people who are interested in true crime want to hear about. Yeah,
100%. I mean, you can always reach me on Twitter at DownHomeFear. If you want to post something on the Facebook group and, get the message to me that way, that's totally fine. You can email me at downhomefear@gmail.com as well. And we always want to hear more ideas, more thoughts, any sort of feedback that you have. It's all very, very much appreciated. If you like the show, remember to subscribe, tell your friends about it, and help us keep getting new listeners. And
we're going to be posting a question for you guys related to the Jamestown story on Facebook, because we wanted to explore what you guys think, how you think the American legal system, as well as, American society, news media, etc., would react to a situation like what happened in Jamestown with survival cannibalism in America today.
So she'll get the question to me and I'll post it on the Facebook group on her behalf. And I think it's a really interesting discussion point. So if you want to check that out and chime in and let us know your thoughts about it. That would be awesome. Anyway, thanks so much for listening.
Yeah, I hope you enjoyed #Christmas cannibalism.
Christmas cannibalism. I'm not sure if that's how this show is going to be branded, but sure. I'd like to thank Amy for coming back on for her third episode, which is crazy. So awesome. Always a pleasure to have you on.
And thank you so much for coming up with this podcast and putting out 10 episodes in 2016. I'm really looking forward to the next 10 in 2017.
All right. Well, thank you all, and we'll be back soon.
Happy New Year.